People recognize that having systems that are more inclusive, having systems that allow greater participation, having systems that allow greater transparency, having systems that fight corruption are more likely to succeed. And this is again why, through an institution like the World Bank, which is apolitical, you can also help transform the undercurrents for societies to evolve and change.
I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Bob Zoellick this evening and to thank him for taking the time to be with us. As everyone knows, Bob is the president of the World Bank and is responsible for overseeing and advancing the bank's vision of inclusive and sustainable globalization. He became the bank's 11th president in 2007, and he brings to this position an immensely impressive record of accomplishment in government and also in the private sector. He was vice chairman of Goldman Sachs before joining the bank, and before that, he was Deputy Secretary of State, the position that was held under the administration of President Ronald Reagan by our own John Whitehead. He held the cabinet post of U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005, and in that position, he forged an activist approach to free trade at the global, regional, and bilateral levels. He played a key role in launching the Doha Development Agenda in the World Trade Organization, and that led to the Framework Accord for Opening Markets in 2004. He was instrumental in completing the accession of China and Taiwan to the WTO, and he actually quintupled the number of U.S. free trade agreements, enacting or completing agreements with Australia, Bahrain, Chile, the Dominican Republic, Jordan, Morocco, Singapore, and the countries of Central America. Not least, during the momentous days following the peaceful revolutions of 1989, Bob was at the Secretary of State, was at the State Department, and he was the lead U.S. official involved in the 2+4 process of German unification. Just one more point of introduction. During the year or so between Bob's leaving the State Department and joining the World Bank, he served on the board of the International Republican Institute, which is one of the National Endowment for Democracy's 4 party, business, and labor institutes that work internationally to advance democracy in their respective fields. And I'm told that Bob frequently said that this was the only nonprofit board on which he served, and that I think shows where his convictions lie, even though I guess you can't talk about it as much when you're at the World Bank. So in any event, that leads to my first question, which is to ask if Bob, if you would share with the audience your thinking about world geopolitics and the relationship between power and economics. And I pose this question because I know of no one in public life today who seems to have a more developed concept of how we can create a more integrated and market-driven world. As I understand it from an article that Bob wrote in Foreign Affairs in 2000, before the 2000 presidential campaign, he wrote that the United States needs a foreign policy that respects power, embraces freedom, appreciates the importance of international norms without making a fetish of international agreements, believes that we must find practical ways in an era of revolutionary change to advance freedom, and recognizes that there are significant forces in the world. And I think, Bob, in that article, you actually used the word evil in this connection, forces that vehemently oppose this way of thinking. So my first question is, might you step back just for a moment from your position at the World Bank and explain to us the relevance of these ideas to the world of 2010.
Well, Carl, before I do that, let me just thank all of you for joining us. I've known Carl and Ned for a couple of decades now, and I've always greatly respected the work. As he mentioned, I had an opportunity to serve briefly on the IRI board. I'd worked with IRI before, but whether IRI or NDI or the business and the labor dimensions, I really think this is one of the creative geniuses of the Congress and the Reagan administration, because in so many places of the world, I've seen the work in terms of trying to help societies help themselves move towards more open systems, whether it be market economics, trade unions, building the institutions of democracy. And frankly, it's been extremely important in engaging members of Congress with international affairs. Their staffs and members of Congress will often go on these missions, whether it's party building, whether it's election observing, and given the demands on members of Congress from their home audiences, I found that this has a benefit simply in engaging people in international affairs. So I want to thank Carl and his colleagues for all the work that they've done on this. I also want to thank the FPA. I had a little chance to talk about some of the activities the FPA does around the world. For someone who's spent his career dealing with the interconnections of the domestic and the international, I just think it's vitally important to have people try to, again, satisfy what I find to be an interest all across the United States to dig into these issues a little bit more, whether it's from a historical side or an economic side or a security side. But it doesn't happen unless people devote themselves to it. So I compliment both FPA and the National Endowment for doing that. On the topic of, loosely speaking, sort of economics and foreign policy, this is one that's in some ways kind of been the leitmotif of my career. And it's intriguing because I think one of the things that happened during the heart of the Cold War was a lot of the thinking about U.S. engagement in the world was dominated by people that came more from the political security side. Understandable reasons. Those were the dominant issues of the day. But if you look back at the history of America in the world, and I once presented a PowerPoint on this when I was at USTR for some of the Defense Department team. From the very earliest days, you think about Alexander Hamilton trying to restore America's credit in the world, which if he hadn't done so, Thomas Jefferson would not have been able to buy the Louisiana Purchase. If you think about the early U.S. foreign policies, the good ones and the bad ones, whether it was the embargo policy of Jefferson, whether it was the freedom of the seas, the whole notion of America's engagement in commerce. But then you go through period after period, the sort of the dollar diplomacy, you know, up to in the interwar period, which is supposedly be a period of American isolationism. You have the role that is played by the Dawes and Young plans and restructuring Europe. So there's a private sector element that is also connected to an economic policy, but it's more fundamental. It also goes to the sense of how do you have healthy societies, but also, as you mentioned, the development of power in the world. Just to give you a sense of something from a historical period that might have applicability today, when you go back and you look at the history of the Napoleonic Wars, there's all the chapters about, you know, Austerlitz and Waterloo and Trafalgar, but I often like to point out that one of the most important chapters is the dry one that people often skip over of how Pitt the Younger restored Britain's credit. And if he hadn't done so, Britain wouldn't have been able to fight a world war over the course of 20 years, where Napoleon basically financed by stealing the property or as a cash basis. So if you're going to have a power in the world, you better have a strong economy and you better think about your long-term financing of your position in the world. And this is one of the interesting things coming out of this financial crisis, is how U.S. and other countries will be perceived in the world. But if you go back to the great period after World War II of America restructuring a world to try to avoid the problems that led to the breakdown in the 30s, the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT that later became the WTO, the Marshall Plan. These are all critical notions of how you connect economics to your broader politics and security. So in some ways, it's interesting, when I was trade representative and we were trying to engage trade agreements, and with the idea that maybe it was of our interest to try to strengthen developing countries, whether it be their democratic political systems, whether it be the cooperation in Central America, whether it be building partnerships. Some people in the economic community thought, well, this is outside the pure trade and economic efficiency. Frankly, I think that it had the multiple benefits, and part of the challenge in policy making is how you can try to find these issues that have the combinations. And just to give you an idea today, the United States has a negotiated free trade agreement with Korea that it hasn't passed. People talk about the U.S. engagement with East Asia. The only free trade agreement we have is one that we completed during my tenure with Singapore. But as the Bush administration negotiated this free trade agreement with Korea, you could start to see some in Japan saying, well, we don't want to be left out of this. And for years, I always thought a free trade agreement with Japan wouldn't be possible because of agriculture protection. But that's now changing. Their farmers are getting older. They're switching to their agricultural policies. I personally believe that if you had a free trade agreement with Korea, you'd likely have some interest in Japan with a free trade agreement, and just think how, in a matter of a few years, that could start to reposition these issues. So to me, it's folly not to think about how you connect your economic policies with your security and political side. And one last point, which we can pursue from a net agenda, is at another level, what is trade and some of these economic issues about? It's how do you open up a society? It's how do you break down old structures, whether they be oligarchies or oligopolies? How do you create opportunity? How do you create chance for a middle class? How do you create new freedoms on the economic side that may have political corollaries? So it's a natural support for an agenda of trying to advance values. Now, of course, there's not a one-to-one linkage. They're going to follow in different paths. But I think it's a mistake to ignore the role of economics in the world in whether American power or American values. And I'll leave you with one last anecdote. Shortly after I became U.S. Trade Representative, Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, came up to me at a meeting and he said, you know, Bob, it's fascinating. Everywhere I go, he said, what people really want to talk about is the possibility of doing trade agreements with the United States or their economic relationship. And just as I talked with some of the ambassadors in this room, we recalled some of the ties that we had from that period. When I saw Secretary Clinton, not long after she had become secretary, she made the same point to me. So what's often missed in the United States is how America engages economically in the world is a big indicator to other countries of our stature in the world. And we'd be foolish not to recognize that.
Well, you mentioned the financial crisis. You recently wrote an article in the Financial Times in which you argued that it's the developed world today, the U.S. in 2008 and Europe right now, that is precipitating economic crisis and seems to be trapped in alternating bursts of Keynesianism and austerity, whereas you argued that it's the developing countries that are focused on promoting economic reform and robust growth. Can you explain to us why you think we must, as you said, look to the developing world, as you wrote, to find a way out of the current crisis?
Well, there's a couple of strains of this. You have a lot of people here I know that have made their career in the financial world. If you just think back to the financial crisis of the 1990s, which was East Asia, Brazil, Russia. At that time, the question was, will China hold the currency peg? That was the big topic of people. Now you can't open up a business page without trying to have a sense of how's the Chinese economy doing, how's the Indian economy doing. And this reflects the fact that we're moving to what I've described as a new multipolar economy. Now let me give you some statistics that drive this. On a purchasing power basis, about 43% of the world's GDP is now in the developing world. The import demand since 2000, over half of it has come from developing countries. So if you look at what people are trying to assess today, we're in a multi-speed recovery. China and India have grown quite well. East Asia has grown quite well. Latin America has done relatively well. Africa has done a little better than expected, but is still coming back. So the issue now is what's going to happen in the European context. So This has a whole host of implications for international institutions, trade patterns, shifting knowledge, and frankly, a lot of people in the business world are quite aware of this as they think about their potential investment. And my point is it's not just to China or India. If you look at Southeast Asia, there's 600 million people, an emerging sort of middle class. 10 years ago, people looked at Brazil as a very protected, closed market. Now they see it as an opportunity. You're going to see more of this throughout Latin America. The Gulf is changing. Now there's still problems, but a lot of the countries in the Gulf are setting themselves up as international logistics hubs. There's different possibilities. And one of the points that I've been making is, and we can talk about this more if you'd like, Africa over time can also be a pole of growth. So this can actually lead to a healthier world economy. Now, another piece that you touched on, though, is lessons. So it's not just sort of the demand to get out of the hole that we're in internationally. And the point I was trying to make on that was that we're now in a period which is understandable after the efforts to put money into the financial system or have the fiscal expansion, whereas Ken Rogoff and Reinhardt pointed out in this book about this time it's different, 8 centuries of financial folly, you could identify that the next question was going to be the repricing of sovereign credit, because you got a lot of sovereign credit out there, and so the question is, what are you going to deal with it? So you're now in a stage where, and this has been in the headlines in Europe, you're having a fiscal consolidation, or people tightening. The point I was trying to make was, if you simply try to tighten on the fiscal side without creating opportunities on the growth side, growth without necessarily more spending, and these are policies you can take on a deregulation side or remove red tape, create additional opportunities for small and medium-sized business and entrepreneurs, you're going to make this task much harder. And what struck me was that last year when I attended a G20 meeting in Scotland, it was dour not only because of the weather, but also because there was kind of a Euro gloom over the meeting, and everything was of a negative sense about what we were going to regulate and how we were going to control this and kind of the bad times. I flew to Singapore to an APEC meeting, and the mood there was very different. Not that people didn't see difficult times ahead, but in part based on their experience in the 1990s. They said, well, we're going to have to create stronger basis of growth. So whether it was Malaysia, whether it was Korea, other countries, they were actually talking about opening up services markets, which they realized, still compared to the US, are more closed, not as competitive, but they saw this as an opportunity to gain additional productivity, additional jobs, additional growth. So I think one of the challenges still ahead of the international community is how can we keep an eye on some of the lessons learned from countries that went through this in the 90s about how we build in growth strategies at the same time that you're having fiscal consolidation.
Well, you mentioned China and India a number of times in what you just said. And you know, these are two great powers of Asia, but they're promoting growth from two very different political models. China offering an authoritarian model of growth, and India a democratic model. And I know that as the World Bank president, you're not really in a position to advocate any political model, and I accept that. But might you still reflect for us on the relative strengths and weaknesses of these two models? In other words, is the built-in accountability of the democratic model an advantage in achieving growth? Or are there also disadvantages in efficiency of administration and decision-making? And are the built-in disadvantages dealing with problems like corruption in an authoritarian system? Are there built-in disadvantages? Because that system happens to lack what we call in the political world the vertical and horizontal forms of accountability, such as elections, independent judiciary, decentralization, free media. I mean, how can you control corruption without these institutions? In a word, how important for growth are transparency and the rule of law?
Okay, let me take this in stages. First, if you think about what's happened in the world since 1991, when India launched its reform process, or China in the 1980s, it's been nothing short of astounding. If you look at the removal of people from poverty, which is also a critical aspect of human existence, this has had an overwhelming effect. And part of the aspects of what's going on in the international economy is that at the end of the Cold War, you had about 1 billion people in the world market economy. Now we got about 5 billion. It's not surprising that the system is going to take adjustments to that. Now, and if you think about what differences that has made in lives and opportunities for people to go to school, the people have information access, simple nutrition, these are truly historic events. At the same time, I think, and these are going to be major economic forces in the world, as I suggested. At the same time, one needs to recognize that the early stages in terms of increasing income and productivity, if you haven't been using factors of production, are going to be somewhat easier than the later stages. So some people here in the room might remember there was a period in the 50s or even the 60s where people thought the Soviet Union was going to overtake the United States because, frankly, the Soviet Union had done a crummy job, whether Russia or the early Soviet period, in getting the most out of its possible economy. So they did have high growth rates for a period. I personally believe that just as you saw in Japan, and you will see in other Asian countries, there will be a point where this starts to level off. And some of the things that more developed economies have to learn, like how at the margin do you increase the use of technology, use of resources, improve productivity, they will also encounter. There's been some writing that suggests, oh, is this the new economic model? Is this going to overtake everything? Look, if you're sitting in Beijing, as the officials are, they don't necessarily think they're on the top of the world. They also have huge challenges. They still have large degrees of poverty. They're going to have a demographics issue. And look at what you read in the paper now. What you're seeing is, of course, there's an increase in desire for their wage rates. So even in an authoritarian system, you see what are labor strikes in a system that's supposed to be a communist economy. In a sense, the labor movement is bypassing the traditional unions. This will actually, I hope, increase their purchasing power. It actually creates other opportunities for development because some of that low-value production might go to other places, and we're working with Chinese firms. Maybe this can also go to Africa and start manufacturing opportunities there. So the next stage would be going back to your point about transparency and openness. My own view is, whatever the society, a more open, transparent, competitive system across countries compels people to recognize mistakes, to have an earlier warning about things you have to change. And obviously, India is a democracy. It's a democracy of 1 billion people. It's going through its own transformation. I think right now, the younger Gandhi is trying to actually transform the Congress Party. That's what he's been trying to do in the nature of also changing Indian democracy. But even take China. One of the former party secretaries I mentioned, I got to know, who is now head of the Central Organization Department, it's the Personnel Department. One of the things that he was known for when he was the party secretary, I think he was in Nanjing, was he was using polling data to try to get a sense of public attitudes. And they are using similar methods to try to assess the performance of officials. So they too recognize they're going to have to be alert to public opinion. Now, this doesn't automatically turn into a benign factor. So if economic growth slows and perhaps there's questions about legitimacy other than based on economic growth, might this raise a nationalist spirit? So there's no simple formula in this. But frankly, what I've found not a huge amount of debate about across different political systems is people recognize that having systems that are more inclusive, having systems that allow greater participation, having systems that allow greater transparency, having systems that fight corruption are more likely to succeed. And this is, again, why, through an institution like the World Bank, which is apolitical, you can also help transform the undercurrents for societies to evolve and change. I'm old enough to recall that there was a period, I lived in Hong Kong in 1980 on a fellowship. And when I was there, my Chinese students I taught at university thought democracy is something for the United States, it doesn't belong here, so on. So this was the rise of Deng Xiaoping at this time from '78, very excited about it. Well, I look back and I look at what's happened since then, and I look at democracy in Indonesia, I look at democracy in South Korea, obviously democracy in Japan, democracy in Taiwan, democracy with its struggles in the Philippines and Thailand and others. So I don't mean to be deterministic about this. I'm not a determinist by any means. But I think that, again, there was a period where people felt you couldn't have economic development in East Asia because Confucian ideology would prevent entrepreneurialism. Well, that one's been put to rest. So these ideas of sort of simplistic notions that are going to sort of drive results in a deterministic way, I think we have to approach with a certain humility. And speaking from the perspective of the World Bank, we also have to approach these issues with a certain humility. So frankly, my view on this is you should be open-minded, you should be pragmatic. There's different things that work in different countries. We ought to try to share that information across countries. And frankly, learn some of the basic things, such as if poverty were so easy to eliminate, it would have been done long ago. So these are not easy things to be able to answer.
I'd like to think that some of those polls in China were done by IRI, but well, I don't know.
No, they were done by the Communist Party.
Well, sometimes they work together.
We thought that was NDI.
No, it's actually IRI, your organization. Any event, in a recent speech, you spoke of the end of the so-called third world and the arrival of a new multipolar and more egalitarian world, which you've already mentioned. Can you explain to us what you mean by that? And if the economic shifts taking place require a change in the global architecture? Is the G20 that you mentioned, the meeting in Scotland, is the G20 a successor club to the G7, or is the very notion of a club in this new world outmoded and too hierarchical? And what kind of financial reforms are needed in this new, more multipolar and egalitarian world, and how is the World Bank adjusting to this new environment?
Carl, the problem is you asked 12 questions.
That's what I was asking
trying to focus on the first one. Okay. Let's start with the third world. Well, I had a very nice compliment. You got somebody here from the Economics Intelligence Unit, because if you read your last week's Economist, they went so far as to recognize this as an idea of debate that
I'm going to call upon it for a question later.
But first off, the third world should have been discarded long ago, because the second world went 20 years ago. So goodness knows, at least the third world should have moved up to second. But my point was more fundamental than learning how to count. It was a recognition that the third world, for many people, was a category of the Cold War. And in a sense, it treated the developing world as a unitary group, not recognizing its diversity, its complexity, and in a sense, either as a residual or a manipulable group in the contest between the first and second world. That time is not only gone, but it's obviously demeaning to billions of people who also have aspirations for a better life. Now, what it also is saying at another level is that the developing world itself has got huge diversity. So we were talking about China and India, Southeast Asia. You look at the income levels of some of the ASEAN countries versus countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So you have to be able to distinguish the circumstances to be able to try to figure out what you're going to do with different countries. Another part of this was to recognize that the old north-south formulations need to be rethought. And so, for example, as I mentioned in terms of pragmatic learning, how can China support Africa's development? How can India support Africa's development? What about the possibilities of South-South trade? This also has implications for some of the international organizations. So you will find actually some larger trade barriers in some developing countries that are impeding other developing countries. So yes, developed countries should also lower barriers, but so should developing countries. So it's a recognition that we need to look at the world differently, including, as you talked about, international structures. So the G7, which was, I used to take part in those meetings back in the 80s with Secretary Baker at the Treasury Department, that clearly didn't represent the key players if you're going to try to deal with the international economy. At a minimum, you need to include some of the major emerging economies. And then there's the debate, as there is in any international system, of how much do you balance power and representation. In a sense, the UN General Assembly is one extreme. You've got everybody there, but like the League of Nations, one country, one vote, will you get the action you need? The Security Council was designed with a different concept based on the failure of the League of Nations. But does the Security Council reflect current power relations? The G20 is another one of these accidents of history. I like to say, a little tongue-in-cheek, it's an organization for our era because there's actually more than 20 countries attend, so the numbers don't add up. But the greater issue there is there's a good and a bad part about the G20. It has more countries that could actually are important to addressing international economic issues. But as anybody in this room would know, if you have 20 countries at a table, or 25 in fact, versus 7 or 8, it's probably harder to have the informal dialogue and to get things done. So I think some of the issues the G20 is going to be struggling with would be, number one, how do they use the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO? I think it'd be a mistake if they create their own bureaucratic structure. They should use our institutions. The World Bank is a G186. We have 186 members. So how can we feed in and support the G20? But I must add, while doing so, we have to be sensitive that I have a lot of member countries that say we're not part of the G20. They shouldn't be deciding for us. So how do you get that balance? Another key issue will probably be in any group the size of the G20, its effectiveness will probably depend on informal interaction. So in other words, what will be, if I were frankly taking this perspective from the US, maybe there's kind of an NAFTA group you'll meet with. To the degree, if US and China agree, that will be very important. What about the US-European relationship? The Europeans meet as a group. You talk about the BRICS. So, as is often the case, you can probably shape some of the policies informally in smaller groups and then try to use the bigger group in a ratification fashion. We've got the flag of the UN here. There's sensitivities of this with the UN. So, for example, China has been sensitive to the inclusion of discussion of climate change financing issues in the G20. In my view, that's a natural to do that, but they're sensitive about being seen as taking that out of the traditional UN system. See, my view is we need to work away from a traditional hierarchical model and think of this more as a network model. So if the G20 could help fashion agreement among the major players for a financing system for climate change, that could help the climate change negotiations. So it's a further expansion of this basic question of something I've been working at in various forms in my career, certainly at the World Bank. How do you make multilateralism work? How do you modernize the institutions of multilateralism to fit a new purpose? I personally believe, just as I was saying, one of the genius of the U.S. Group after World War II was that they recognized that while the U.S. was a major power, it needed both for effectiveness and legitimacy to work with other countries, whether alliances, trade agreements, institutions. How do we overhaul that for a different purpose? And obviously the logic also extends to the emerging powers. Some of the people here know when I was in the State Department, I developed this concept for China of being a responsible stakeholder. This is the same issue. How do you have stakeholders in the system that share responsibilities? Let me just close with one other thought on this. We recently were able to achieve an agreement on a capital increase for the World Bank. First time in 20 years, because in this financial crisis in the past 2 years, we've done about $120 billion worth of business, been a critical support for countries, but we needed more capital. In doing this, one of the things that I'm particularly pleased about, but it's not sort of a headline issue, is over half the resources of additional capital will be coming from the developing countries. Sometimes price increases, sometimes access to some of their investment in the bank we didn't have access to, sometimes additional access as they got additional votes. And if I think back at, say, the Copenhagen discussions, if you could get the developing world to share 50% of the load of that issue, people would have thought it would have been pretty damn successful, or in the WTO issue, which I dealt with. So as a student of these multilateral organizations, part of the challenge is how do you get countries to share responsibility, which, by the way, means they're going to have more of a voice, too.
And is that how the World Bank is making its adjustments in the current period?
Well, that's one way. There's a lot of other aspects. At the staffing level, which is more within my influence, I made a conscious effort to increase both women and developing country people at all the levels of the organization. I think it strengthens the organization. There's a lot of talent out there. It brings different perspectives. Another aspect is the basic thing that I think we need to be more sensitive as an institution to treat countries as clients. There was a period, perhaps 15, 20 years ago, where the bank would sort of come in with wisdom and thou shalt follow it. I don't think that works. And there's a lot of knowledge out there that, frankly, we can benefit from, transfer to others. So it's a network model, it's a problem-solving model, it's a client service model. It's recognizing that much of the main activity of the bank is not finance. So we have a problem. We're called bank. And so most people think that our main job is putting money out the door. In effect, even if you take the numbers that I talked about, those who are dropping the bucket in international markets. So when we work best, we are trying to transfer some knowledge and learning from around the world to client countries. We're trying to do it in a way that the project has a reach beyond the individual project. So it may be building markets or institution or capacity, maybe carbon markets, maybe microfinance markets, it may be aspects of local currency bond markets. And then what distinguishes us from an OECD or a university is we do have money to bring in. And what we're trying to be more innovative is different ways of doing that. So right now, derivatives are a bad, dirty word. Well, let me tell you, I'm using rain derivatives to help the country of Malawi, which is totally dependent on rainfall agriculture, so that if it doesn't have enough rainfall, it gets money to survive. So sometimes derivatives can be good things too. So these are innovations. Another thing that people here may be interested in, our basic financial intermediation model had been borrow, and we either make loans or investments through IFC, our private sector side. We've now created an asset management corporation. We have an $800 million fund as a start, which are doing investing through our IFC platform in private investments in sub-Saharan Africa and to a degree Latin America. And this is an intriguing possibility because it's one I launched before the financial crisis. I thought the financial crisis would actually sort of lessen investors' interest. But what I found is we have a sovereign wealth fund from Korea, Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, and a Dutch pension fund. And when I talked to the Dutch pension fund, they said, look, we now know developed markets are risky too. We think the long-term growth prospects are better in some of these developing markets, but we don't know where to go. The information costs, the transaction costs are high, so we can help build that market, build an opportunity for other investors to come in. So these are some of the changes that we need to make as an institution to modernize multilateralism.